So, maybe you've seen over the last week there's been talk, or there was talk, kind of disappeared already, but I wanted to go back to it. This Dove ad that everyone was so outraged about. Evidently, it's racist, and you're supposed to understand that. It's a really big deal, and if you're socially conscious and morally superior, you don't really have a choice in the matter. You're seriously appalled, and you're really shocked, and you're all astonished and stuff. So, I don't know, let's just take a real quick look at the ad. So here, that part wasn't racist. That's the racist part. So in this video, I'll leave a link to it. That's the actress. She goes on to explain it, and we'll kind of get into that a little bit later. I tell you what, it's getting to be really, really ridiculous out there. So you saw the ad. So you have, evidently, it's, I don't know, some of the things that people say about it. I guess what makes it racist is that people are claiming, the people that are outraged are claiming that it is because it's supposed to be making a black person who they for some reason people think are dirty. I don't know where they get this. This is a black person and they're dirty and they use Dove and then they're clean. Whoever thought that? I've never heard that except from the people that claim that this is happening. I have my whole life been around white people. I've never heard it. I've never heard it. And if I have, it's been so fringe, so inconsequential that it didn't stick. I don't understand. It's kind of like when you bring up, when people like James Hawethorn from the Ghetto News Network or Tommy Sotomayor bring up things that are happening in their communities, in the black community, and people attack them all of a sudden and call them all the racial slurs as though they're not supposed to complain about it, which to me thinks that they've been convinced that that's just how black people act and that you shouldn't talk about it. It makes absolutely no sense, and I don't know anybody that thinks like that. It's also the same thing that people seem to think when people from the black community point out things that they think should not be happening in the black community. They accuse them of doing some kind of a dance for white people, and that behind their backs, white people are laughing at them. Again, something I have never ever seen or heard about. But what's interesting about this ad is that what we do see is a white woman who takes off her shirt, and then she's not a white woman. Now, if white people got upset about that, you would see outrage at the audacity that they had to be upset about it. But if you don't think that it's racist for the first part of the ad, a black woman takes off her shirt and then it's a white woman, if you don't think that's racist, then you're a racist. You see that dichotomy, that inconsistency there? And that's what I talked about in my previous video. People are being treated inequitably on an increasing basis. All the while, there's this incessant shout for equality. This is a perfect case in point. Because what's happening is we're not treating people equally. We're treating people inequitably, and that's not what equality is about at all. So in the midst of all the outrage, I was fortunate enough to see a conversation. It was a professor, so this is someone who has a PhD, interestingly, from a country that has a neighboring country wherein they're right now, killing people based on tribalism, right? They're all African, but they're hacking people and they're, committing violence against each other based on tribal divisions. Essentially the same thing you see happening here. So I just think that's interesting to point out because he posted this ad and made the obligatory claim that it was racist. Then there was an acquaintance of his who happened to be a white male. That's your first problem. Don't be one of those, evidently. And then certainly don't have an opinion if you happen to be one of those who didn't think it was racist. Probably because, you know, the white lady then takes off her shirt and then it's not a white person, and he probably didn't feel anything about that because that'd be ridiculous. And so he just figured it'd probably be the same. But no, he was told that he was unconsciously racist. So let's talk about this. So this is someone who has a PhD telling a white person that they're unconsciously racist. Well, a PhD should know that predominantly your mind is unconscious, subconscious. I've heard 88% of your mind is unconscious. That includes people with a PhD, just in case you didn't know. So what he's saying is that even though his own unconscious he doesn't have access to, but he's going to tell someone else about their unconscious. Just a thought. I find it interesting that there must be some magic you get when you have a PhD, a piece of paper and a plaque to hang on your wall that says you're smart and now you have magic and you can, you know, read people's minds. I just don't understand how you don't see that, you know, having a PhD. And then someone from the country that neighbors him, his country, his home country, pointed out, you know, this tribalism that is going on right now. And also, you know, some of the racial slurs that are used by black people against other black people, the tribalism that exists in their own communities here. And then, not the black communities, but from the immigrants from Africa, they still, you know, engage in this tribalistic ideology. And also, you'll have horrible racial slurs towards white people as well. And he defended that, and that when they do it, when they use racial slurs, like, for example, one I've heard in my life, all white people smell like wet dogs. Whatever, you know, it means nothing. But he said that's defensive, whereas when white people do it, it's offensive, just because of the color of their skin. But let's point out another thing that a PhD holder should know very clearly. To say that it's defensive when you attack somebody, when you're actually going out of your way to attack somebody and you claim that that is defensive, what you're saying is that that person's existence is offensive. You see what I'm saying there? To say that someone should have to deal with racial slurs because they're white, and that just means, you know, someone else is, you know, the black person is being defensive, you're saying that the white person's existence is offensive. And again, someone with a PhD should understand that. You should be able to think clear enough to understand this. Okay? And then, of course, he also went on to use that condescending. I think he said something like, any student of history would realize that only the dominant culture can be racist, and blah, blah, blah. And we'll get back to that. So how could this woman, the actress, this pretty lady, how could she be tricked? How could this woman be tricked into being in a video or an ad that was portraying such ridiculous racism? So in this video, she goes on to explain the context. Oh boy, the context. Essentially saying that what Dodd was saying was what they were trying to say is that all skin is equal, all skin deserves, it may be different, but it still all deserves the same care. This is what the Declaration of Independence is saying, incidentally. We're all created equal. We may not be equal because that's that wonderful diversity. We may not think the same things, our minds may not work the same way, but we all have equal value and we all have equal opportunity. That's how you get to equality and justice. And this is what they're trying to avoid. We'll get to that too. But the context, the truth, the intent when it was told doesn't seem to faze people. There was a book written in 1985 by Neil Postman. It was called Amusing Ourselves to Death. And he was talking about how the new medium of television was changing the way the messages and the way the information we get is received, and actually the whole content. But what he said back then was that Knowing the facts has taken a new meaning, for it does not imply that one understood implications, background, or connections. And here's a case in point. You can lay the connections, lay the backstory, lay the context at people's feet, and yet they will say, no, I am going to tell you what your intention was. That's ridiculous. I mean, it's just absolutely ridiculous. And that also reminds me of when Bertrand Russell, I think it was in The Impact of Science on Society, said that, talking about how they're going to educate people, the science of education, that the populace will not be allowed to know how its convictions were generated. So we're kind of getting to that point now. Unfortunately, it seems to be the case. So when you have someone who has a PhD and this is their thought process, and they're not able to see these things and able to, notice these inconsistencies, you have to wonder how that happened, right? Well, you have to understand that the education system in this country has been drastically altered, gradually. In fact, the actual definition, the working definition of what education means has been changed. In Charlotte Iserbyt's book, The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America, it's a great book, she brings out the two different definitions. This definition, this initial one, is from 1927 in the New Century Dictionary of the English Language. It said that education was the drawing out of a person's innate talents and abilities by imparting the knowledge of languages, scientific reasoning, history, literature, rhetoric, etc., the channels through which those abilities would flourish and serve. Okay, so it's drawing out your innate human abilities, making you fully human, more, cultivating your humanity, essentially. Well, in an outline of educational psychology, this is a 1934 book by Rudolf Pintner, and others. Here's the way the definition was kind of changed. Learning is a result of modifiability in the paths of neural conduction. Explanations of even such forms of learning as abstraction and generalization demand of the neurons only growth, excitability, conductivity, and modifiability. The mind is the connection system of man, and learning is the process of connecting. The situation-response formula is adequate to cover learning of any sort, and the really influential factors in learning are readiness of the neurons, sequence in time, belongingness, and satisfying consequences. So it sounds, yes, like a lot of psychobabble mumbo-jumbo, but essentially what it says is, instead of trying to cultivate your humanity, we're going to treat you as a lab rat, as an object of stimulus response. That's what education is today. And why would they do this, though? I mean, what would be the purpose of making this kind of a change? Well, at some point, there rose up these big tax-free foundations. They were formed by some of the richest people on the planet. And I don't begrudge people making money. I will talk about rich people a lot. The only reason I do that is because we always hear this thing about, oh, rich people are bad and capitalism is horrible. Except these capitalists are the ones that we talk about here are the ones manipulating and changing things, and they're often seen as benefactors and philanthropists when they are nothing of the sort, if you want to maintain your individuality and not become some sort of a robot for them. So let's see. This is a quote from Reverend Frederick T. Gates. He was a business advisor of John D. Rockefeller. This was said in 1913. Remember, the definition that we just read, the newer one, came from 1934. So this is 1913. So let's see where their mindset was in 1913. And then you have to think, did they work towards these goals? Let's see. This is what Frederick T. Gates says, Rockefeller's business advisor. In our dream, we have limitless resources. and the people yield themselves with perfect docility to our molding hand. The present educational conventions fade from our minds, and unhampered by tradition, we work our own good will upon a grateful and responsive rural folk. We shall not try to make these people or any of their children into philosophers or men of learning or of science. We are not to raise up among them authors, orators, poets, or men of letters. We shall not search for embryo great artists, painters, musicians, nor will we cherish even the humbler ambition to raise up from among them lawyers, doctors, preachers, statesmen, of whom we now have ample supply. This is a common theme throughout history. They don't want thinkers, they want workers. They want people that are malleable to their will. So this brings up something else. This is another quote. This is actually this gentleman, Robert Hutchins, in the introduction to the Great Conversation, the great books of Western civilization. It's a 53-volume set that was released in 1953 and 1954. But this is what he said in the introduction. We believe that the reduction of the citizen to an object of propaganda, private and public, is one of the greatest dangers to democracy. A prevalent notion is that the great mass of the people cannot understand and cannot form an independent judgment upon any matter. They cannot be educated in the sense of developing their intellectual powers, but they can be bamboozled. The reiteration of slogans, the distortion of the news, the great storm of propaganda that beats upon the citizen 24 hours a day all his life long mean either democracy must fall prey to the loudest and most persistent propagandist, or that the people must save themselves by strengthening their minds so that they can appraise the issues themselves. Now, these tax-free foundations were formed. The Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the Carnegie Foundation, Guggenheim, and they have worked their will upon the education system. In fact, what's interesting about it is that if you look at the minutes of their meetings and their yearbooks, what you find reference to largely when they're speaking of education is more about public opinion. Manipulating, educating public opinion. So in the minutes, and you can go find the minutes of the Carnegie Foundations, the Rockefeller Foundations, and see what they were talking about. And it's dressed up in really nice language, but they keep talking about public opinion, educating public opinion, not showing you all the issues so that you can decide for yourself, but telling you what you should think about them. Now, decades ago, people started to kind of figure out what was going on with these foundations, and there were investigations into them. There was the Cox Committee and also the Reese Committee. Here's one of the things that they actually said based on their investigation of these tax-free foundations. Education is one of the vital areas involved in this attack on the American system. The field includes not only elementary and secondary schools, but also our colleges and universities. The tax-exempt foundations are directly involved because they have supported this movement in the past and are still promoting it in ways which restrict educational activities and control public opinion. Okay? And I also want to share with you a couple of quotes. This is from Renee Wormser. This is the counsel to the Reese Committee that investigated the tax-free foundations. It says this: "It is difficult for the public to understand that some of the great foundations which have done so much for us in some fields have acted tragically against the public interest in others. But the facts are there for the unprejudiced to recognize. The power of the individual foundation giant is enormous. When there is like-mindedness among a group of these giants, which apparently is due to the existence of a closely knit group of professional administrators in the social science field, the power is magnified hugely. When such foundations do good, they justify the tax-exempt status which the people grant them. When they do harm, it can be immense harm. There is virtually no counter force to oppose them." So, you understand what happens here is that, yes, they have so much money that they can do things that are good. They certainly can, but at the same time, because they're held in such lofty status because of their ability, their capacity to spread money around, they're also involved in this underhanded way of trying to control people's minds. And this one is interesting. This is from 1934 yearbook of the Carnegie Endowment from page 22. They say that a worldwide organization has been built up at a minimum of administrative costs, through which the endowment is in contact with the public opinion of nearly every land. Not the education, mind you, the public opinion. The endowment is consequently not a money-granting but an operating body, and it operated through its own agencies, either directly or through those which become substantially its own through their spirit and method of cooperation. So you see what they're saying there. That they basically take ownership of these other agencies because they can come in, they have the money, but you're talking about levels of money that none of us can comprehend. And technically it's our money. At least in cases where they're using tax dollars to do their, work. Now I want to include one final quote here. This is from Carroll Quigley, who Bill Clinton had called his mentor. He was a professor in Georgetown University. He has since passed away. But this is what he said. This is because also, along with these tax-free foundations, you have groups like the Council on Foreign Relations. And they're worth looking into, for sure, just to find out who they are. But then, they represent very, very big money interests globally. Okay? This is what Carroll Quigley said about the Council on Foreign Relations, because they work closely with these endowments, these tax-free foundations. He said, Carroll Quigley says this: "The board of the CFR have carried ever since the marks of their origin. There grew up in the 20th century a power structure between London and New York which penetrated deeply into university life, the press, and the practice of foreign policy. The American branch of this English establishment exerted much of its influence through 5 American newspapers, and these included the New York Times, New York Herald, Tribune, the Christian Science Monitor, and the Washington Post, as well as one that's no longer existing, the Boston Evening Transcript." This was said a long time ago, so you can imagine where their influence has reached to this point. So, the point I'm making here is you see this white supremacy narrative being pushed everywhere. White people are racist. That's just the way it is. It's inherent. But when you look at history, what you notice is that those in control that have manipulated the education system, this is old white money in many cases. Not money I have access to, nor you. Doesn't matter the color of my skin. I don't have access to it. Doesn't give me any privilege. They would not have me. I don't count to them. Nor do most of you. Doesn't matter the color of your skin. They will use you if you're willing to help them. That's basically it. But the question is, why would this old wealth, which is predominantly white, I will grant that, why would they push the white supremacy narrative so hard? Can you figure that one out? Do you think that for 1 second their doing so is going to threaten their power structure? They obviously don't think it would, otherwise they wouldn't be doing it. They're not going to shoot themselves in the foot. When they've arranged everything in their favor, why would they do that? So you have to ask yourself seriously, what are you supporting when you're supporting this ridiculous narrative? This illogical, irrational narrative? What are you supporting? Because as we can see, even someone with a PhD cannot see clearly through the fog that has been created. And let's go back to this PhD holder who said that every student of history realizes that, only the dominant culture. Well, what you have here is a dominant culture of extreme wealth pushing the narrative that these people with PhDs and everyone in the media is, and they're so in outrage about all these things that are happening. So what I would say to that PhD holder is that actually, to be perfectly honest, what history actually shows clearly is that by treating our fellow humans inequitably, we will never, ever, ever arrive at justice. Anger, resentment, hatred, of course. Vengeance and revenge, certainly. Violence, oppression, absolutely. Domination and tyranny, undoubtedly. But never, never justice. Any student of history would realize that.